We have a very dangerous future if we sealed the border today based on who Biden has let into the country. So I have refused to vote to fund the government while they're perpetrating the border invasion. President Joe Biden brought with him an administration that has been all too willing to use power, weaponize the power of their offices against their political opponents. And unfortunately, he's running a campaign totally based on lies and deceit and distortion, trying to use allies of the former speakers, millions of dollars, to try to distort my record, to try to deceive folks in the 5th District, to try to fool them into thinking that maybe I'm not what they've seen over the last 3.5 years since I've represented them.
Our founding fathers here in this country brought about the idea that you and I have within ourselves the God-given right and the ability to determine our own destiny. The only way they can inherit the freedom we have known is if we fight for it, protect it, defend it, and then hand it to them with the well-taught lessons of how they in their lifetime must do the same. Freedom is never more than one generation away from extinction.
In 1776, one of the founding fathers, James Madison, was only 25 years old. Yet he stood for freedom. He was a young man who fought to be free from tyranny. And I find a lot of camaraderie between his age and my generation today in our fight to save the country. You're here to join us and talk about all things about James Madison, about what's going on in Congress today, and his election next week. Congressman Bob Good, who also serves in James Madison's seat. Congressman, thanks for joining us.
Great to be with you, Christian. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here. I know it's a busy day. You just had a vote just a few minutes ago in Congress to hold AG Merrick Garland in contempt of Congress. Could you walk us through that vote a little bit and what that means for going forward?
Well, we do need to hold him accountable. He has been demonstrated to be willing to abuse the power that's been placed in him. Obviously, he's not elected. But when President Joe Biden was sworn in January, he brought with him an administration that has been all too willing to, again, abuse power, weaponize the power of their offices against their political opponents. And AG Garland has been at the tip of the spear there as the head of Biden's Department of Injustice. In this case, he, of course, has refused to cooperate with Congress. As you know, Congress, and particularly the House, are the people's representatives, those who are most accountable to the American people. It's not the judicial branch, obviously. It's not the executive branch. It is the legislative branch, the people's representatives, and particularly, again, the House, that is most accountable and who is supposed to have constitutional oversight over the executive branch and the federal agencies and departments and so forth. And so Merrick Garland has a lot of questions to answer, a lot to answer the American people for how he has conducted himself in office. Most egregiously, of course, his cooperation most recently with these rogue prosecutors in New York and in Georgia that have gone after President Trump simply because he is the nominee for the Republican Party for the upcoming presidential election, but Joe Biden's presidential rival once again. And so has demonstrated contempt for Congress, and he's being held accountable, and hopefully we will be able to do just that.
And Congressman, I applaud you and the whole Republican caucus for standing firm today. It was really a party line vote that I saw, 208 to 207. I want to take you back a little bit, back to last fall, where you also stood firm as one of the Gaetz Eight, they call it, who voted to oust Speaker at the time, Kevin McCarthy. Could you walk us through your thought process of voting to oust the Speaker? What led you to be courageous there?
It has to go back really to a year and a half ago, to January, before we got to October. But in January of 23, when the Republicans had the new House majority, the American people trusted us with that majority to do everything we could to block the Biden-Pelosi-Schumer agenda, to try to do what we could to stop, if not roll back, with just one house of one branch of government, the harmful policies, the spending levels that are destroying the country. And we were the only thing standing between, we are the only thing standing between full Democrat control. Well, many of us, particularly in the House Freedom Caucus and some of our allies like Mr. Gaetz, felt like Kevin McCarthy, who had been in leadership in the Republican Party for some dozen or so years, didn't represent the change that we needed, the transformational change that Congress needs, the Republican Party needs, to reverse the harm, whether it's to secure the border or whether it's to and the reckless spending that's bankrupting our kids and our grandkids, and again the policies that are doing so much harm. So we fought Kevin McCarthy becoming the presumptive speaker, and as you know, we went through 15 rounds of ballot for him to become speaker. Unprecedented in 150 years that members of Congress had voted against their own presumptive nominee, showing great courage, I would argue, in terms of risking their own political careers to do that. And in addition to the uncertainty and the gravity of just a decision like that, if he were to be blocked, and then you would go through a process of trying to select another speaker without knowing the outcome of where that might lead. Ultimately, he did become speaker because 14 of the 20 resistors, if you will, agreed to change their vote from no to yes in exchange for his commitment to bring a balanced budget to the floor for a vote. And he failed to do that. To let us vote on term limits, he failed to do that. To impeach Secretary Mayorkas, he failed to do that. To release the J6 tapes, he failed to do that. To bring all 12 appropriation bills to the floor, he failed to do that by the September 30 deadline. In addition to going back to things like regular order, majority, open amendment process, and so forth. And the things that led to October that you were asking about were primarily the debt ceiling increase, where a majority of Democrats voted to raise the debt limit to January of 25, no limit to it. And that was, again, done with about half Republicans voting for it, but 90-something% Democrats. And then the continuing resolution that he promised not to do on September 30, where, again, it was passed with 90-something% Democrats and about half of Republicans, keeping in place the Biden, Pelosi, Schumer policies that we ran against, that we campaigned against, and again, the spending levels that are destroying the country. So all that led to the October question that you were asking about, where we just felt like, the current trajectory with the debt and the border in particular was just not sustainable. We weren't going to get there with him as the leader. Mr. Gaetz was ultimately the one, as you know, who made the decision to file the motion to vacate. And I had let he and my close colleagues know that I couldn't vote to retain the former speaker. It's hard to know when's the best timing to do something like that, again, because of the uncertainty involved. We knew we weren't going to elect a Democrat speaker. That was never an option, of course. That was never a risk, because we knew the Democrats were going to continue to vote for Hakeem Jeffries. And we had at that time a 9-vote margin, so we were in a much stronger position than we are today from a majority standpoint. But that's kind of what led into it, was the failures of the previous speaker.
I really applaud you for that as well. I think that reminds me of James Madison. Like I said at the beginning, he was a big proponent of holding your government accountable, which he did himself. Then he got into Congress himself. But right after Kevin McCarthy was ousted as speaker, he eventually resigned shortly after, correct?
Yeah, I think he demonstrated that he wasn't in it for service to the country. He certainly wasn't in it to serve the constituents in his district. Unlike 434 other members of the House, he was unwilling to serve in the House unless he was the speaker. And of course, we've seen since that time, when he resigned in December, that he's been, calculating his revenge tour to go after those who he holds responsible, not holding himself responsible, but the others that he holds responsible for him not being speaker. He's tried to direct millions of dollars in primary challenges to those that he blames for him no longer being speaker.
So what has he been doing since in December, targeting the Gaetz Eight, especially with your opponent, John McGuire?
He's gone after some others, Nancy Mason in South Carolina, Mr. Gaetz in Florida, Eli Crane in Arizona, and some others, trying to find willing primary candidates that if you wave enough money in front of them would be willing to lie, cheat, and steal, try to win an election, do or say anything to win an election. So he has found an all too willing accomplice in my opponent. My opponent is one of those perpetual candidates, always in search of a race. I've run for two things in my life, and neither of which did I seek out on my own. In both cases, I was encouraged by constituents, voters, members of the community to run. One was county supervisor in 2015 in Campbell County, right outside Lynchburg. And then in 2020, a congressional race for the first time against an incumbent Republican. Again, neither time did I seek those out. Both times people came to me and encouraged me to run. My wife and I prayed about it and eventually felt the Lord's peace to do that. My opponent, on the other hand, is a relentless candidate, perpetually in search of a race. He's always running for something. He averages more than one race a year. And, he just won state Senate in nomination back in May or June of last year, said he wouldn't run for Congress because he had to pretend he was a supporter of mine and wouldn't challenge me in order to win that nomination. And then he has an uncontested race in November. And after he wins in November, before he's even sworn in January, he declares he's running against me. And unfortunately, he's running a campaign totally based on lies and deceit and extortion, trying to use allies of the former speakers, millions of dollars, to try to distort my record, to try to deceive folks in the 5th District, to try to fool them into thinking that maybe I'm not what they've seen over the last 3.5 years since I've represented them. But I don't think they're fooled by that. I believe we're going to win on June 18 and send a message that this seat's not for sale.
And if I lived in your district, you'd have my vote. Unfortunately, I'm still here in Delaware. I'm not voting back at college. But walk us through your campaign strategy against McGuire this time around.
Well, we're emphasizing what we have run on. What I ran on and what I have focused on are really 3 primary areas. Number one, the border invasion. I've been to the border 6 times. I've tried to highlight that issue. I've tried to fight against funding Mayorkas and Biden's border invasion, the 12 million illegals that we know of who come into the country, the irreparable harm that's already been done, the future that we are facing as a nation with not just the 10 million who surrendered to Border Patrol for all the free stuff Biden gives them and the fact that he lets everyone and anyone into the country. The Democrats truly believe that everyone around the world is entitled to come to this country legally or illegally, and they should select whether or not they get to come here rather than America having the right to select who comes here. But then there's the 2 million gotaways, the most dangerous ones, the ones with criminal backgrounds and terrorist ties and trafficking drugs and children and so forth, who pay the cartels even more to evade apprehension. We have a very dangerous future if we sealed the border today based on who Biden has let into the country. So I have refused to vote to fund the government while they're perpetrating the border invasion. On the other hand, Republicans like the one supporting my opponent have voted to fund this border invasion and even voted most recently in the omnibus spending bills that we passed in March. They voted with 90% of Democrats to give Mayorkas a $3 billion raise. The other things that I have focused on on the budget committee is trying to reduce our spending, that I think it ought to be more than a campaign talking point, that the debt and the deficit are truly unsustainable and are destroying our country. That's why we're having so much inflation. That's particularly hitting young people and lower income folks and senior citizens and so forth. Grocery prices, gas prices, utility prices, housing prices, rent and mortgage rates and all that. That's really causing so much suffering to the American people. That's bad policy. And I think that it should be more than campaign talking points. And I've actually fought to reduce our spending, and I've voted against the spending increases and, again, to fund the policies that we campaign against that are in place now from when Democrats had full control. And I've not been willing to vote for these continuing resolutions just to keep the government operating while we talk about how much danger we're in from a spending standpoint. And then finally, I have voted and fought to protect our constitutional freedoms, which have been under assault like we've not seen in modern times. Certainly during your school years, your high school and college school years, you have seen your most precious freedoms trampled upon in the name of a virus, a China virus that came across, and the way the government did so much harm and suppressed the truth and put out so much disinformation. The abuse of power against political opponents of this administration, whether it's pro-lifers, whether it's parents at school board meetings or Christians practicing their faith, or those of us exercising our Second Amendment rights, the willingness to try to rig elections and to try to have relaxed standards that facilitate cheating in the voting process, all those kind of things. So again, I've tried to emphasize those same things that I ran on. I've actually did what I said I would do. I've gotten around the district. We have large crowds turn out for us. My opponent does not. Just give you an example, Christian, from the past week. We had Steve Bannon do a rally with us on Friday, 4 days ago. We had 500 people in Powhatan County. We had Senator Rand Paul do one in Lynchburg Monday a week ago, 8 days ago. We had 400 people there. My opponent brought Marjorie Taylor Greene to his home county and had 15 people. He brought a swamp creature, Ryan Zinke, from the moderate congressman from Montana to Lynchburg for a meet and greet. And it was such a small turnout, they didn't even put any pictures out or talk about it afterwards because it was so embarrassing. So the enthusiasm is behind us. The grassroots are behind us. The elected officials across the district, the locals are behind us. The GOP leaders across the district are behind us. Literally every elected official in his home county of Goochland County outside Richmond, my opponent, is supporting my campaign. That says a lot. Those who know him best like him least. I believe we're going to win on June 18. I believe we're ahead now. We're just going to run hard, do everything we can to make sure we win until that day.
And I'm greatly relieved to hear that. And I think our country really needs people like you up there. And what you stand for, the issues you just walk through, I think they appeal to all Americans. That's what we all need. That's what Biden's attacked, especially my generation. Because there's three things that Biden's really done, really screw my generation over in a sense. We can't speak freely. We can look back at bills, say, perhaps like the TikTok bill, selling it from China to a U.S. company, say like Meta or the people who own Facebook, Instagram. We can't speak freely. We can't walk freely. At least Lake and Riley can't, but illegals can under Joe Biden. And we can't spend freely. Inflation, we look at all of the economic impact that we've seen over the past 4 years. I mean, anyone in their right mind would say that they were better off 4 years ago. Which really pleads the question. I would ask you why you're the better candidate in this race. But I think your ratings stand for themselves. Look at Heritage Action, give you a 99 or 100% score. We could go down the list, Club for Growth, another 100. You're the better candidate overall. Why shouldn't anyone support McGuire?
Well, I certainly can't make the case for him. I think if you look at the voting record, I've been one of the most consistent conservatives in Washington. That's why, as you know, the most conservative caucus in the Republican House, the House Freedom Caucus, voted me as their chairman back in December. The members actually chose me, the 35 members of the House Freedom Caucus. I have actually done what the first time I ran, Christian, I only won with 52%. And if you win with 52% in Washington, you usually end up with a moderate rhino who tries to be careful and benign and vanilla and tepid and doesn't want to take any chances and doesn't fight hard because they're afraid of not getting reelected. Well, we fought hard and we stood for the things we said we would stand for. And then I won with 57% the second time. I hope to win by even greater margin in November. But before then, I've got to defeat this opponent here. And again, while the D.C. swamp is very much against me, the perception in the media, the perception of D.C. is very different than the reality on the ground in this race. If my opponent, there's a reason why he wouldn't debate me. And challengers always want to debate incumbents, but my opponent wouldn't agree to any debates because he knew he couldn't defend his record. He couldn't defend his campaign ads. He couldn't stand up in front of voters or even in front of me and take questions. And so he has refused to do that and hoping that he can just win this race with sort of the Biden basement strategy of running the TV ads with the millions of dollars from D.C. and California. But again, I don't think the people of the 5th District are going to be fooled by that.
I don't think they will be either. If you're in the 5th District, I urge you to vote for Congressman Bob Good next Tuesday on June 18th. We've got one or two more questions here. You mentioned Manila and benign members of Congress in the swamp. I think a lot of Christians today would say that Christians can't be in politics. They corrupt a Christian. But I look to Capitol Hill, I see a few people, and one is you. I see you up on Capitol Hill, keeping the faith and remaining a strong Christian. How do you do it? What's the key? What are you doing?
When I first answered the call to run, and my wife and I, again, prayerfully did answer the call to run, my determination was to try to be salt and light in Washington, to be a witness there, just like I was trying to be in my previous professions. And my prayer was, Lord, help me to be more concerned about not offending you by what I don't say than I am about offending others by what I do say. Help me not to deny you with my silence. Help me not to suppress the truth in my remarks and my words and my testimony and my stance. And I've, by the Lord's grace, tried hard to be the congressman the Lord would have me be, to be the congressman that I believe is consistent with his will for me. And I'm reminded a little bit of Daniel, the biblical character, who before he went to Babylon, before he was deported and sent off to this heathen country, it said he purposed in his heart that he was not going to sin against his God, and he was going to take a stand. And he literally risked everything. That's why he got thrown in the lion's den. He had the great influence over his friends Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who were thrown into the fiery furnace because they took a stand for their God. And I think when you go into the battle and you know what you stand for, you know whose you are, you have your principles in place. Really, D.C. hasn't tried hard to get me to compromise or to corrupt those things, I think, because I just don't have the sign-on that says I'm for sale. But there are some others. I've got a couple of dozen friends here who there's an iron sharpens iron component to it. There's not enough. We need more. But there are some, I call them courageous conservative warriors, who not only believe the right thing. There's a lot of Republicans here who believe the right things, but it doesn't matter what you believe if you're not willing to fight for it, to take a stand for it, to risk to risk things that are precious to you, like getting reelected, in order to try to save the country. And the country certainly needs saving.